Hi everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Sorry we started a couple of minutes late. Seem to be a few issues with the server, but it looks like people are managing to log on now. My name's Kate Halliday. I am lead for FDAP, and I'm really pleased to be offering this webinar today. I'll be chairing the session. The reason we've organised this webinar is because I picked up, not only from myself, but from other providers who I've spoken to, some confusion around the webinar agenda. And so we've invited an expert to talk about this. There's also going to be a trailblazer event organised, which is our expert Scott's going to talk about this, but basically it is for people who are involved in our sector, in the drug and alcohol sector, to talk about what they need from training for apprentices. And I'm going to ask towards the end, there's going to be a questionnaire if people might be interested in being involved in this. So hopefully today's not just going to be about education, it might be about actually encouraging some of you to get involved in the apprenticeship agenda. Now, before we start the talk, you'll have a panel on your screen that allows you to ask questions, and we can put these to Scott at the end of the session. So please do type in a question if you've got one for Scott, and also if you're having any problems with sound or anything like that, type in a question. I will do my best to answer it. If I can't, not to worry, we're recording this session and it will be available to everybody after the event, so you can watch that again. And also, if we don't manage to get around to answering every question, Scott has very kindly agreed to pick up any unanswered questions over email. And if you think about something after the event that you didn't ask, that will be fine too. Okay, so with no further ado, I'm going to ask Scott to begin the presentation. Scott is Scott Wildman, Dr. Scott Wildman, I should say, is the Centre Director for the Centre of Apprenticeships at the University of Kent. So over to you, Scott.
Hello, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for this opportunity. So I'll quickly whiz on to the next slide. So as you've said, I'm from the University of Kent, and my role at the University of Kent is Director of the new Centre for Higher and Degree Apprenticeships. So I'm a central body within the university that oversees our delivery of apprenticeships. In the picture you can see on this slide, I'm stood with a cohort of higher apprentices that are currently studying for the laboratory scientist apprenticeship. And it's something the University of Kent has been doing for a number of years, and I've been involved in for at least 5 or 6 years. So I'd like to begin now with a background. I'm starting at a relatively low level, so forgive me if people already know this. If you've picked up a newspaper or you've looked online, you will see that the government is actively promoting higher and degree apprenticeships at the moment. And it's promoting these as an alternative to traditional university study. And I guess the strap line is along the lines of get a degree without the associated debt, because obviously an apprenticeship by definition requires that individual to be in employment. So the difference between a higher apprenticeship and a degree apprenticeship, there are some intricacies in there, but at the very bottom level, what we're talking about here is the academic qualification, or the level of the academic qualification. So a higher apprenticeship relates to levels 4 and 5, which is essentially years 1 and 2 of a traditional 3-year degree course. And a degree apprenticeship relates to levels 4, 5, 6, so that could be your BSc or your BA, or a level 7, which would be a master's level, or the whole range through from 4 through to 7. Now again, if we look in the newspapers, not just the Conservative Party manifesto, but all the other manifestos pledged to create new apprenticeships. But the Conservative Party in particular have pledged to create 3 million new apprenticeships by 2020. This isn't just higher and degree apprenticeships, it's all apprenticeships across the board. We believe the 3 million number is a target that will be easily achieved, and hopefully in later slides you'll see why I say that. So to facilitate this pledged growth in apprenticeships, the apprenticeship levy has been launched. Primarily this is why I'm speaking to you today. So the next slide tells us a little bit about the apprenticeship levy, and I'll slow down a bit here just for clarity. So first of all, I'll deal with the bullet point at the top. So if you're an employer in England and your annual pay bill is greater than £3 million, you will pay what is essentially a tax, and that will go into what's called the levy pot. This levy pot has been described as a virtual bank account that employers can look into, and you can use that bank account to train apprentices. You cannot use it to employ apprentices, but you can use it to cover training costs. We believe that there'll be about 20,000 employers in England that will be paying this apprenticeship levy, and it will equate to approximately £2.3 billion. As you can see, this represents a huge pot of money for training, and I always like to put these things into context. So the University of Kent will be paying the levy, and the University of Kent itself will have approximately £650,000 a year to spend on training. Now if we move down to the second bullet point, this refers to employers that don't have that greater than £3 million pay bill. And for those employers, there will be plenty of incentives from the government. They would have to apply for the funding through a training provider like the University of Kent, but up to 100% of the training costs will be covered. So essentially they get the same package. Interestingly, we estimate that 98% of employers in England will be non-levy payers. The government has committed £450 million to support apprenticeships for non-levy payers up until July 2018. Obviously there'll be more funds after that date. And in one of the latest reports that I've read, it's estimated that non-levy payers, so this 98% of employers, will be taking on, or at least a quarter of them, will be taking on one apprentice between now and January 2018. So it's envisaged there'll be a lot of apprenticeship activity. So the final bullet point says that this virtual bank account, if you're a levy payer, will be managed by the Education Skills Funding Agency, formerly the Skills Funding Agency, and it can be used to train apprentices. So I reiterate, it can be used to train apprentices but not pay their salaries. And when we talk about apprenticeships, we're talking about higher and degree apprenticeships as well as all the other levels. Now, the tax, the apprenticeship levy, we started paying last month, and organisations that are paying the levy are paying on a monthly profile. And now that we've passed May, employers can draw down on that money and start to use their levy pot. The second bullet point on this slide I think is of particular interest. Levy pot funds will expire after 24 months. So some believe this to be a relatively short period of time. I believe it to be a time for thinking and planning. So companies shouldn't worry, they're paying the levy on a monthly profile. That money was safe for 24 months. So there's plenty of time to develop a new apprenticeship or think very carefully about how you would plan to spend your money. The final bullet point I think is a very, very interesting one, and this applies to both levy payers and non-levy payers. It's predicted that this apprenticeship money that's available will be in the first instance used to upskill the existing workforce rather than bringing in new talent to a company. So what do I mean by that? I'm a believer of using working examples. So let's think about the University of Kent for a moment. I told you before that we have a levy pot of about £650,000 a year. The first thing the University of Kent is likely to do is look amongst its existing workforce and see what the training needs are for its existing staff. And if there's an appropriate apprenticeship out there that matches the job role that the person is trying to fulfill or working towards, then that person could be put on an apprenticeship. So if I use myself as an example, I have a first degree in pharmacology and a PhD in neuroscience. However, I'm now in a management role and I have no formal management training. It would be highly appropriate for the University of Kent to put me onto the Chartered Manager degree apprenticeship using its levy pot to fund my training. My salary would stay the same, my job title would stay the same. However, 20% of my time would be diverted into training, i.e. studying the management degree. So if I move on to the next slide now, again, I said I'd like to take things quite slowly. So this slide details some basic terminology for apprenticeships. So if we look at the first bullet point here, had I been given this presentation 2-3 years ago, I would have been talking about frameworks. Now we're in the apprenticeship reform period, and apprenticeships are moving towards what's known as standards or trailblazer standards. So these new apprenticeships that are being developed all the time are designed by employers. So arguably, well, it's been described as being more fit for purpose. So what do you need to develop a new standard? You need a consortium of employers, at least 10. They sit around a table. They think about a unique job role that they all share. They then discuss what would be required of that apprentice. So the second bullet point actually talks about the standard itself. And the standard is typically a 2-page document, and there is an accompanying document called the assessment plan. But if we deal with this standard itself, this 2-page document first of all, this could be seen as the roadmap for the apprentice. And what it describes is what the apprentice should be able to do upon completion of their apprenticeship. So from the University of Kent's perspective, we're looking at higher and degree apprenticeships because we're a higher education institution, and there are over 70 of these apprenticeship standards that have been approved so far for delivery. Each apprenticeship that is approved by the government has a funding cap, and this dictates how much funding can be taken from the levy pot or claimed from the government. To ensure that there is QA for an apprenticeship, typically we have these things called endpoint assessments, and this is where an independent third party comes at the end of the apprenticeship and assesses the apprentice to see if they've met all the requirements that have been stated in that apprenticeship standard. Now the final bullet point, I sometimes put this one in just for my own benefit. I think it nicely describes what an apprenticeship standard is trying to cover. And I think the easiest way to talk about this is to break an apprenticeship standard into 3 areas. And the next slide hopefully does this in a visual way. I'm a visual learner, so I find it much easier to draw pictures. If you look at the blue circle, so I'm now using my mouse to circle, the light blue circle here is what I would call the apprenticeship. So within the apprenticeship, you've got 3 core areas. The first one in blue is the knowledge, which is the qualification or the off-the-job training, so usually in this context, a university degree. The blue is the on-the-job training, so the competency part. Sorry, did I say blue? I mean green is the competency part, the on-the-job training, and the red is the behaviours, which are the behaviours that we would expect the apprentice to exhibit throughout the apprenticeship. So an apprenticeship is made up of a knowledge qualification or a degree, whereby the apprentice must commit 20% of their time to studying, which is essentially 1 day per week. We have the competency part, which is their training on the job. And we've got the behaviours part, which is how we expect them to behave. The apprenticeship standard that's been developed by employers details what is required in each of these 3 areas. At the end of the apprenticeship, when the degree has been awarded, the training is completed, and we have evidence that the behaviours have been exhibited, the endpoint assessment takes place to ensure that all 3 areas have been met. And if all 3 areas have met, the apprenticeship is then awarded. It is my job in the Centre for Higher and Degree Apprenticeships at the University of Kent that if we are the provider of an apprenticeship, is to ensure that all 3 areas are completed throughout the apprenticeship. And to do this, we work with employers and apprentices visiting the apprentice at least 4 times a year. So just to be clear, an apprenticeship is based on a job role or a job title. It's not a qualification, it's not based on a qualification per se. The university can help guide employers create one of these apprenticeship standards. However, they cannot lead the process. And once an apprenticeship standard is launched, which has been developed by a group of employers, then any university, any provider can then deliver the knowledge component to that. So just briefly touching upon the University of Kent's strategy, because as I say, we're in apprenticeship reform at the moment and everything's changing. The University of Kent has launched a central service, the Centre for Higher and Degree Apprenticeships, for which I'm the director. And my job is to advise on apprenticeship standards, and that's both internally and externally. There are significant contractual aspects and difficult financials, so the university centre also manages those parts and can advise employers. We manage the learner data, submitting this to the government. We manage the competency and behaviour components, and this is achieved by visiting apprentices in the workplace. And we offer a managed service to employers if they so wish, so to help the process. And finally, we facilitate the delivery of knowledge, so the degree qualification via its subject experts that sit within specific schools in the university. So I'm currently in phase 2 of my strategy, where I should be assisting, or I am assisting employers in developing new apprenticeship standards. So that's getting cohorts of employers together to discuss their needs and to see if there is a need for an apprenticeship. And in the background, I'm sat there trying to deliver or prepare, develop material of a high quality should that apprenticeship standard get approved. So how have we ended up here today? I think it's probably nice to just quickly summarise. So a member of University of Kent staff and academic, Professor Alex Stevens, I believe hosted a meeting on the 8th of May. In that meeting, there was a discussion around potential job roles in this sector where it would be appropriate to develop an apprenticeship standard. And I believe 2 job roles were highlighted, a drug and alcohol treatment worker and a drug and alcohol treatment manager. Obviously the manager was at the higher level. After that meeting, it was suggested that the DANOS standards would be a good platform for creation of such an apprenticeship. And an action point was that employers on the FDAP list, which is over 30 employers, should be contacted to see if there was a passion to develop apprenticeship standard or standards. I understand that a larger meeting has been scheduled for all interested parties in July, or will be scheduled in July, to discuss creating a new apprenticeship. And before that meeting, it thought it would be very helpful if somebody could provide some background information on apprenticeships required, hence the webinar and hence the reason why I'm speaking to you right now. So I think all that's left to really cover now is if at the meeting in July, if there is a desire to develop standard or standards, what would be required in that process. So the next slide is a slide that I've taken from the government website, but I think it nicely highlights the steps into developing a new apprenticeship standard. So the first box refers to development of an expression of interest. So this is where the group of employers should get together. They should discuss this job role, they should discuss the requirements of that job role, and if everybody's a consensus that this is a very good idea, they would then submit an expression of interest to BIS. Then hopefully, if approved, you would then move on to the next step, and this is where the employers working with providers, including, for example, the University of Kent and professional bodies, would start to develop that standard. So that would be that 2-page document. After that, you would then start thinking about the assessment plan, which is a more significant document that talks about how that apprenticeship will be assessed. And then hopefully the final sign-off will be achieved and you'll be ready to develop your apprenticeship. So from the very start to the finish, it's estimated that this takes approximately 12 months, although there are cases where it's been a little bit quicker and obviously a number of cases where it's taken a lot longer. This next slide talks about that very first box, the expression of interest, because I guess that would be key to this audience. So to submit this expression of interest, to talk about it in a little bit more detail, there is an online form that is submitted to the Institute for Apprenticeships, and that outlines this occupation of interest. And I reiterate that that has to be an employer-led process and can't be led by a provider, i.e. the university. This is an application to become a Trailblazer group, so until the expression of interest is accepted, you are not a Trailblazer group, but if it is accepted, you become a Trailblazer group. And you would then be given permission to sit down and start drafting this 2-page document, which is known as the Apprenticeship Standard. And in that standard, you would detail the knowledge, the competency, and the behaviours required. So the final bullet point is taken again from the website. However, I think there's some interesting points in there. So Trailblazer refers to a group of employers working together to design the new apprenticeship for an occupation within their sector. The group must consist of at least 10 employers, which must include at least 2 SMEs. And the group would need to liaise with a relationship manager at the Institute for Apprenticeships before they could make this submission. They also need to be able to demonstrate demand, and in some cases this has been by providing current job adverts for these roles. So very briefly, an anticipated timeline could be an expression of interest, which would be made June 17. You can submit these every month. You expect a response within 6 to 8 weeks. If given the green light, you've got up to 12 months to write the standard. There is a public consultation in that part, but also whilst writing the standard, you should be developing the assessment plan also. Hopefully everything gets approved and you're ready for final delivery, which could take, as I say, approximately a year. This final slide just summarises the process. Again, just reiterates employers bid to become the Trailblazer group by writing a new standard. They then develop the standard with providers and professional bodies. They then move on to the assessment plan. And hopefully you're ready for delivery. And I reiterate, any training provider that's on the government register would then be able to deliver the knowledge part of that apprenticeship. So what's next? Should you decide to meet as a group, and you should think about developing standards, the sort of things that you might want to discuss are these roles occupationally unique? There's no overlap with apprenticeship standards that have already been approved. Are you a representative group of employers? Is there truly a demand for these roles? What sort of academic level would be appropriate for the apprentice? You would need to nominate a chairperson who would interact with the Institute of Apprenticeships. You would need to contact the Institute and be nominated or assigned a relationship manager. You could then think about a date for submitting your expression of interest, drafting up the standard, which would obviously help the submission, and start thinking about what providers you'd like to work with so they can advise on appropriate knowledge qualifications. And then in due course, discussions would be about what competency, so what on-the-job training would be required, what knowledge, so what qualification would be required, and what behaviours you would expect of this individual. So I think that is my last slide, so thank you very much. And by all means, as said before, if there's any questions, feel free to email me. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Scott. I've got a few questions that have come in. The first one is about whether there's been, or whether it has been considered to have substance misuse and mental health standards. And before you answer that, because I was at the initial meeting, I know there was certainly discussions about how, although there are drug and alcohol workers, there are specialisms within the field. So I think certainly we had a look at, for example, a children's worker in a different field, as in, you know, not in substance misuse. They developed a standard that covered community children's workers and then also residential workers, but they were both within the same standards. So I think that's possible, isn't it, Scott? You can have specialisms within the same standard if the employers feel that's the right way to go.
Absolutely, 100%. There's a good number of approved standards now that have what I like to call streams. So they have streams of knowledge within them where you could specialize in one rather than all the others. I think what you raise is a very important point there. As I said in my talk, there's lots of apprenticeship standards coming out. In fact, every month we're seeing new ones. Because you can imagine there's lots of roles, occupations in England at this time. The danger is that we will be flooded with so many apprenticeships, and I suspect the government have realized this is a real possibility, and so they're currently looking for, let's say, broad apprenticeship standards so that if you could potentially tick one or two occupations. So there has to be some clever design in there, and I would say you probably don't want it too specific. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does, because already I'm thinking there's several roles within the sector, for example, criminal justice.
I mean, there is, sorry to interrupt, there is a lovely example that I've been told anecdotally, and that refers to the theatre industry, and they thought about designing a standard for set building. And in their standard, they talked about you would have to be able to work with wood to design the sets, etc., as well as various other things. And that was, the expression of interest was rejected because it was too similar to the carpentry apprenticeship standard. So I like to use that as an analogy because I think you could take some information from that situation.
Right, okay, thanks, Scott. Got a couple of fairly practical questions. If an apprenticeship degree was set up and it was the University of Kent, for example, and the services in the north of England, how are people going to be able to study?
Absolutely. Yep, that was a very good question. So first of all, as I've tried to keep the talk as impartial as I could, obviously I had to mention the University of Kent a few times, but the thing to be clear on is once an apprenticeship standard is approved, then it doesn't matter who you developed it with, who you received advice from, anybody can deliver that apprenticeship standard if they are on the government training register, of which there's hundreds and hundreds of organisations. So you wouldn't be duty bound to work with the University of Kent if we'd advised throughout the process. However, saying that, the University of Kent's USP is to develop a blended learning approach for most of its apprenticeships. And by that, I mean that we don't expect our apprentices to come into the university one day a week. There are summer schools, there are blocks of teaching where the apprentice is expected to come and visit us, but we do rely on distance learning formats, so e-learning, forums, interactive forums, so on and so forth. So for the apprenticeship standards that we already deliver, that hasn't been such an issue, and we have a good number of learners that are scattered across the country. Barnard Castle, I think, is one of my favourites because that's, they really do struggle to find a provider that's nearby.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And another very practical question. When would someone need to begin an apprenticeship hire or degree in order for the employer to be able to reclaim the levy that they have just begun to pay?
So, yep, they have 24. So if you're a levy payer, you have 24 months to start before you lose that initial monthly payment. So, but clearly you're acquiring more and more each month. So if the company's objective was not to lose a penny through the levy, they've got 24 months for this to be approved and to appoint somebody, and then they could start drawing from their levy. Obviously, if you're a non-levy payer, timing isn't an issue.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. Those are the questions we've had so far. So I'm going to leave it at that with the questions, but again, if something comes up that people who are watching this think about, please do email us either at FDAP or, as you can see, Scott's got his email up on the screen at the beginning of this. Oh yes, and on the final slide. So do send questions to Scott. If you're an FDAP affiliate, and there's a few of you there, I'm going to be emailing to ask if you're interested in becoming involved in part of the trailblazing. But you don't have to be an FDAP affiliate, and there's quite a few of you there too. I must say we've had a real wide range of people join this webinar, from the biggest employers to some of the smallest but perfectly formed employers. So, and really we need to have that sort of representation on the Trailblazers group. So please do let us know if you're interested. You're going to be getting an evaluation form when we finish this webinar that we'll ask you directly as well. And so I'm going to leave it at that, other than to say thank you everyone for watching the webinar, and thanks to you, Scott, very much for presenting that as well. Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay. Thanks everyone then.